It is in the cathedral where you really feel that life itself has become congealed. One could say it was a congealed life. The cathedral is often compared to a wood or to the branches of a tree. All sorts of animals ran up and down those spires. It is wood that has become stone, or spirit that has become incorruptible matter, and the architecture symbolises the struggle from which it arose. In the Gothic cathedral, this conflict is fully developed and fully represented in the enormous height and depth, in the light and the shadow, and in the extraordinary complication of all those architectural forms melting into each other or fighting one another. It is also expressed in the peculiar arches built outside the church to support the walls inside. It gives one the idea of tremendous tension, of a thing that is almost bursting. You realise how daring the whole enterprise was, to catch so much spirit and matter, and what they had to do in order to secure it. C.G. Jung, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, notes from the seminar. In medieval cities, the cathedral is the spiritual heart of the city. It's the place you barricade when barbarians come from the eastern steppes. It's the bosom where spirit and matter are said to collide. The spiritus mundus, as in the Jung quote we open with. The cathedral is a complex net made up of academic institutions, corporations and the state apparatus. This is the enemy of the Dark Enlightenment and, they think, the only thing, the only thesis that can oppose their New World Order.
We can all feel it. A falling apart, a dismantling, a relentless questioning of something. A coagulation that feels at once imminent and abstract. Something we feel we could grasp, but also a phantom, a spirit. We find ourselves sucked into a proton pack calibrated to a spectrum wide enough to pick up a motley crew of social forces. Aggressive activists lumped in with global corporatists. Inclusivity quoted Disney movies with black-pilled anarchists, all held together in an ever more adhesive bowl of association, pointed towards the woke mind virus, the liberal world order, the feminist, Marxist oligarchy. To understand this picture, we need to rewind back to 2011. To a text so influential on the right wing, it might just find itself gilded in gold leaf in the post-democratic megachurches of the future. The text, the Dark Enlightenment. So let's back up to the simple question. What do media conglomerates, the World Economic Forum and social science-pilled members of the professional managerial class have in common? According to Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land, quite a lot. These three represent the pillars of what Yarvin, in his garb as Mencius Moldbug, famously dubbed the Cathedral. In this video, we will be outlining the construction and significance of the cathedral as Yarvin and Land understand it. We'll be doing this through the Dark Enlightenment because it opens many more doors for future discussion on the current moment we find ourselves in. So if you're scratching your head, wondering why there are so many fingers pointing your way, stay tuned.
For the Dark Enlightenment, the cathedral represents the religious structure of the ruling class. It's an ideological monolith, but its method of ruling over its dominion is novel from the traditional Marxist understanding of this category. To say this is already to invite correction by hordes of hungry Marxists of all styles and stripes, insisting that, no, capitalism, neoliberalism is the dominant ideology. Not so, says Land.
Logically, it cannot be. The power of the business class is already clearly formalised in monetary terms, so the identification of capital with political power is perfectly redundant. Proof for this is quite easy to follow if you suspend your disbelief for a moment as to who you think the ruling class is. Think about it like this. If I, a rich oil magnate, hedge funder, Labubu importer, want to use my wealth to influence policy, public opinion, etc., to whom do I extend the begging bowl? The answer to this question is one answer to what Land and Yarvin jointly contest to be the ruling class, or the cathedral. Already, as a committed leftist, rule-bound liberal or otherwise, we might be raising our voices to say, but surely the man with the begging bowl able to influence these bodies is the ruling class. Stay with us, To speak aloud or to understand is not necessarily to agree with. The bodies to which my begging bowl is extended to, filled with money of course, would likely include administrative, legislative and judicial bodies, the media and academia. So the ruling class must exist in these areas, but we have a problem. Surely it can't be all administration, all legislation, all judicial bodies, all media, all academia. To suggest this would be to point out conspiracy. Unless we had a narrative structure or ideological underpinning to these areas to which individuals in these institutions unconsciously adhere. Enter the spiritual dogma of the cathedral. We'll define this in a number of ways, but let's start with the most fun. It's the non-Hitler, or the not Hitler. Hitler is sacramentally abhorred in a way that touches upon theological first things. To recognize his historical singularity and sacred meaning is near mandatory, since he is affirmed by all men of sound faith as the exact complement of the incarnate God. Let's take land seriously for a moment. What does this mean? In the cathedral, Hitler functions as an event horizon, a point beyond which it is impossible to go or think. This is not to say that Land is suggesting we should fondly imagine a world in which the Nazis won. Rather, he wants us to think about the significance of Hitler in the 21st century as an absolute, undeniable evil. And what is evil if not a clean-cut Disney story or religious category? It's here that the cathedral is at full operation in its purely negative moment. Whilst we may be compelled to cringe at this kind of argument, let's try to stay serious. Although soaked in edgelordery on the surface, the idea that the image of the Nazis has been wielded by a mostly neoliberal elite to bring about a rules-based world economy isn't exactly unfathomable. And how else would this have been possible without knowledge of Hitler, the Nazis, as evil? It's impossible not to think of Nietzsche's tirade against moral certainty in Zarathustra. Quote, "When I came to man, I found them sitting on an old conceit, the conceit that they have long known what is good and evil." So why is Hitler so significant? Imagine a religion structured on the idea of not that. This religion has at its core a denial of all that may question its validity, hegemony, etc. A lot of religions are imagined like this. Judaism as the chosen people, the not them, Christianity as the light, the not darkness, and so on. At its basest form, the sacred Hitler is a portal to moral knowledge. Let's take an example of this principle in practice, a hate crime. According to Land, hate testifies with special clarity to the religious orthodoxy of the cathedral. Evaluated from, let's say, outside the cathedral, what is so special about a hate crime? Since a murder is a murder is a murder, the answer must point towards some purely ideational, ideological, or even spiritual element present within the judgment. This is also present in the term hate speech, or simply object abstracted hate. Hate for Land is, quote, "an offence against the cathedral itself, a refusal of its spiritual guidance, and a mental act of defiance against the manifest religious destiny of the world." It's quite obvious what we're talking about here. We're talking about protected characteristics, race, religion, gender, and this is what makes the Dark Enlightenment such a tough pill to swallow for the left. But you don't have to swallow it, you just need to understand it. Context is important too. The Dark Enlightenment talks about the cathedral in 2011, a time when the online culture wars were just starting to pick up steam. Gamergate takes off in 2014, the online right-wing backlash to a feminist RPG, and Mark Fisher publishes his Exiting the Vampire Castle in 2013, where he lambasts an online strand of leftism for dragging names through the mud in the name of ideological purity. Russell Brand being the example he uses, a figure destroyed by a mostly leftist audience following his famous appearance on Paxman and subsequent activism. Condemnations initially spoke to his being male, being white, and were ceremonially held up once accusations of his sexual deviancy were made. Brand's interview with Paxman is significant in the context of the Dark Enlightenment, specifically because he advocates a leftist exit strategy. The significance of this will become clear in future videos. He proposes a refusal to engage in the system, a complete rejection, and the left's response is a complete rejection of him. According to Land's analysis, however, the idea of the left exiting the system it critiques is tantamount to a paradox, since the left is prefigured on that system. Its aim is to overcome it, rather than to leave. Let's move on. The landscape from which Land is framing hate has since made its way into the IRL and plays a big part in our politics. You can be arrested for hurling abuse, you can be arrested for inciting hate online. Cases are few and far between, and the stories are often misrepresented and muddled, but as a generalization, this is a truth. Viewed from the right-wing perspective, this is the conceit that Zarathustra points to. Two objections to this framing are clear. The first is to say that the above idea is boring to the point of irrelevancy. What is and isn't wrong is always going to be judged against a moral backdrop, and that morality will find its grounds in a spiritual attachment to a set of grand ideas or ideals. This is something that Nietzsche would also agree with, since as he puts forward in Beyond Good and Evil, the project is to revalue and invert eternal values. He points towards a new order in Europe, which will acquire a long, terrible will of its own, that will be able to cast its goals millennia hence. So the idea is not to do away with morals and values altogether, rather to reevaluate them, to construct new ones. Therefore, to point out that moral knowledge exists within what Nietzsche might call the herd is tautological. Simply put, morality for Nietzsche is a herd instinct, and belief is necessary for those who follow the moral code. Now, of course, Nietzsche is writing for a mostly elitist audience, and I think the same is true for the Dark Enlightenment and Yarvin. Nevertheless, to point out that something is moral and has no material basis is not to say that it isn't real in some sense. And I think Land would agree with this. In fact, we've mostly been channeling more of a Yarvinian diatribe here, since we are interacting with his thought through Land. And for Yarvin, oftentimes a sound strategy is to point out spiritual or religious attachments to certain doctrines and imagine that makes them redundant.
For the Dark Enlightenment, one would be better off accepting that the world is more like the Lord of the Rings universe than it is like the liberal world order we say it is. In LOTR, a wizard is always a wizard, and an elf is always an elf. This isn't strictly true, by the way, since elves can live finite human lives if they sacrifice their immortality for love. And of course, wizards can be grey, they can be brown or white, but let's not get distracted. In Lord of the Rings, each race is born to their lot, and as such, they are restricted precisely by what they are. In what I call the Dark Enlightenment's essentialist move, a peasant can never become a king. And just like in the Lord of the Rings, people are what they are, and the Dark Enlightenment seems to like that. I call this an essentialist move because Yarvin perpetually invites us to enter into an older, pre-Enlightenment world where things and people are what they are forever. There is no movement in the hierarchy. Everybody is bound by what they are preordained to be. This, I believe, is an attitude they have taken almost directly from Nietzsche. Nietzsche too, by the way, has a similarly essentialist attitude towards man. For Nietzsche, man does not make himself what he is, but is born with certain materials and minerals. It is true that traits can be aesthetically forged by man, like a blacksmith might forge an axe, but even if man has the ability to forge part of what he becomes, for Nietzsche, one cannot forge what was not there to begin with. As he writes, in the end, things must be as they are and have always been. The great things remain for the great, the abysses for the profound, the delicacies and thrills for the refined, and everything rare for the rare. If one were to think differently to Nietzsche here, that is, if you were to think that all men are born equal and ought to be equal, for instance, that is because you've internalized slavish values, courtesy of Judeo-Christian revolution. Lang continues what I call an essentialism more abruptly. People are not equal. They do not develop equally, their goals and achievements are not equal, and nothing can make them equal. Substantial equality has no relation to reality, except as its systematic negation. Violence on a genocidal scale is required to even approximate a practical egalitarian program. So I will go on now to make a big claim. The Dark Enlightenment, Yavin, land, figures at the heart of American politics, insofar as they are a political movement, are trying to implement Nietzsche's re-evaluation of all hitherto values proposed in Beyond Good and Evil. I believe the Dark Enlightenment wants to experiment with what such a post-Christian re-evaluation might look like in practice, that is, as a political system. For Yavin, it looks like a corporatist monarchopoly.
And this term, neo-cameralism,
looks like installing a CEO king who rules citizens as if they were employees. One might ask, why is this okay? Why should we accept it? Why would anyone accept it? Because okay is not even a question. That is why. Because the CEO is better than his employees and is not guilty about it. To have guilt about being better is to fall back into Enlightenment values. Indeed, for the Dark Enlightenment, an arrangement where a CEO rules over economic zones would be to enter into a post-Christian political order. If one were to fight this, one were to fight it, in the same way as you might fight against the essentialist vision that people are simply not equal, then you're fighting it because you still have a Puritan heart. In some sense, the Dark Enlightenment believes you will defend liberalism because you still believe in God, as Yavin says. Our so-called democracy is dependent not on the wisdom of the people, but on the internal power politics of the official church. Either way, we have consigned the state to an unaccountable conclave of bishops. Why this is an improvement on monarchy or any other form of autocracy is unclear. This political architecture is commonly known as theocracy. Oddly enough, the classic historical case of a theocracy is those strange people we call the Puritans. To be crystal clear, the Dark Enlightenment is suggesting that if one were to fight the becoming of a monarchopoly, from the perspective of the state, for instance, or of any existing government, or even from the perspective of the liberal individual, then that is because you still secretly believe in a dead Christian God, and the values that dead Christian God professed. A famous passage from Nietzsche he's mentioning here. After Buddha was dead, they still showed his shadow in a cave for centuries, a colossal, horrible shadow. God is dead. But given the way people are, there may still be caves for millennia in which his shadow is displayed. And we must still defeat his shadow as well. To hammer the point home, the Dark Enlightenment thinks that the shadow of God is Enlightenment values. It is progressivism. It is social justice. It is the modern democratic farce. It's Downing Street. It's Congress. It's the EU. So if the D, that is the Dark Enlightenment, gets what it wants, if we have a Dark Enlightenment, no longer will the master race have to pretend to revere the shadow of a dead god cast on the walls of the cave. The meek, then, will not inherit the earth.
Let's lighten the mood a little bit by offering another objection to the notion that those with protected characteristics are possessors of true, meaningful power. This objection is taken from Byung-Chul Han's Psychopolitics. In it, he states, "The greater the power is, the more quietly it works. It just happens. It has no need to draw attention to itself." Of course, in this quote, Han is begging us to think about structural or systemic power. Power that doesn't argue with you about what you're going to have for dinner or which political party you're going to vote for, but rather lays out the available options from which you can choose. Power that feels the need to assert itself and therefore consistently defend itself cannot be said to be truly powerful. We can even see this used in conservative rhetoric around terms like the silent majority. The loud minority, therefore, cannot be said to be indicative of true power, and certainly not the true power that could be controlling a system as large as a world economic order. In fact, the increased volume from these groups could only be said to be indicative of one thing, which is a feeling of losing power. A claim which, let's be honest, has far more empirical backing than the one we are seeking to discredit. Let's think about the Cathedral from another angle, as a logical form. A key theme of the Dark Enlightenment is that of voice. In fact, it entirely defines the neo-reactionary movement. No voice, free exit. Voice is here used to describe expression in a political sense. The interesting thing about voice, though, is that it ought to be voices, or argument. In an argument, we expect two or more parties to come into disagreement and discuss until a solution is found, a single solution. Here we run into an unexpected critique of leftism in general, in particular Marxist-Leninism, which Land claims rings throughout the cathedral's domes. Understanding this claim takes a quick foray into logic, but stick with me. In the dialectic, we have two opposite forces. Let's call them A and not A. Through a resolution of the contradiction between these two, we arrive at a new position, B. This final position is often called synthesis, and according to Marxist principles figured on Hegelian dialectics, this is how history moves forward. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's a huge simplification. Technically, A generates not A as its indistinguishable opposite, and the revolution between these two goes on to generate B. But that's not really how we're using it here. Capitalism, for Marxism, falls under the weight of its own contradictions and marches forward to communism. But something about this argumentative structure bothers Land in the way it is enacted today. Quote, "Everywhere that there is argument, there is an unresolved opportunity to rule." Why is this? Because our two positions above, A and not A, just became one, B. And if you can set the rules of contradiction, you, my esteemed friend, can achieve synthetic ascendant rule. It's a nice argument, and one that does account for authoritarian tendencies in Marxist movements without the typical appeal to revisionist elements. Land frames this nicely, looping straight back into the racial scaries. Quote, "When any political discussion firmly and clearly arrives at the topic of race, liberalism wins. That is the fundamental law of ideological effectiveness in the shadow fragrant shade of the cathedral." Now might be a good moment to point something out. The cathedral needs its heathens, so I take this picture to not only be an indictment of leftists or liberals, but also of their with them as always right wing or conservatives. Even when the right ascend to power, they find themselves stuck in the cathedral, either doing the one nation conservatism thing, we care but also money, or gleefully playing the Nazis with a coy smile. The first of these is a capitulation as Land sees it, the second is to inhabit the prefigured model of the Antichrist. Let's continue to punch right with this theory, towards capitalistic elements in the cathedral. For a hardcore leftist trying to catch a break here, it might be better to see this picture as what we understand by neoliberalism, the corporatist element of the current movement, obsessed with public-private partnerships, politicized money, and bank bailouts. Land does seem to critique any and all redistribution to cover for the failures of others, seeing it as the slowing down of a coming inevitable consequence. Sure, this would include welfare systems, but by extension, it also includes low to zero interest central bank loans and socialized losses. Good examples of the corporatist lobby might include the Office for Budget Responsibility, the World Economic Forum, the EU, etc. Interestingly, the second two of these figure prominently in alt-right objections to the liberal world order. They are the adults in the room when it comes to being a big boy politician and spending correctly so as to keep the stonks bros happy. Land is similarly critical of the ways in which our spiritual commitment to egalitarian principles has been weaponized hawkishly for the complete opposite. The wars for democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, for instance, or we might also reference the appeals to feminism in the proposed invasion of Iran. Certainly, internal contradictions are evident. The turf attack on trans individuals might be seen as another example, or the reference to homophobia in criticisms of Islam. Clearly, the formulations are coming undone in strange and unforeseeable ways. And these arguments are coming from inside the cathedral. So what's the projection of the spiritual death spiral? If things continue as is, Land has a scenario. Quote, "Post-modernity, amounting essentially to a new dark age in which Malthusian limits brutally reimpose themselves. This scenario assumes that modernity 1 has so radically globalized its own morbidity that the entire future of the world collapses around it. If the cathedral wins, this is what we have coming." In future videos, we will unpack more of his proofs for this assumption, but let's take it now, solely in reference to the cathedral. This quote is to drill home the assumption that population limits exist, and maybe you don't believe that. And of course, developments in agriculture have proven Malthus wrong again and again. But that's not to say there isn't always a Malthusian horizon round the corner. Climate impacts, soil exhaustion, antibiotic resistance. Indeed, the current trajectory of consumer capitalism certainly has its Malthusian limits. As producers race to the bottom and consumers decadently give chase, the limit is the only thing I can think about. Another limit is clear in Land's work, and one that really, truly ought to be taken seriously on the left. That is, the limits to agreement. There are many issues that we need not see eye to eye on, and to demand otherwise is to slide into synthetic totalitarian tendencies, a place we do not need to be. Perhaps not all rights need to be given or ensured by a state, as the Cathedral ordains. The right-wing argument here is that to be protected by a state is in turn to lose a sense of liberty. The backlash to this kind of state building seems abundantly clear and would likely be no different under a more equitable economy. It would only take one trans denier to spark outrage and thus re-enter the spiral, even if we were living in a fully automated dreamscape. So, we're 14 years on from the publication of the Dark Enlightenment and the initial laying down of the idea of the Cathedral. And a lot has changed, but has the left learned any lessons? It's learned some. Thinkers like Catherine Liu and Angela Nagel have made insightful contributions towards the argument that something in leftist discourse is perpetuating the current moment of our neoliberalism. Neither contest that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but that ideas are still yet to be accepted by a left wing only slowly recovering from a decade of identity politics. Questions still remain as to whether we can exhume leftist thought from the liberal corpse without sacrificing too much. What do you think?